Good afternoon, and welcome to the Michigan Department of Education's Spring 2023 Teaching Comprehensive History webinar series. I am Corinne Edwards, and I have the privilege of serving as the Director of the Office of Educational Supports here at the Michigan Department of Education. This series, associated with the comprehensive teaching of U.S. and world history, is the vision of our State Superintendent of Public Instruction, Dr. Michael Rice. It is through this vision that we advance our efforts to provide an assurance of Michigan students having opportunities to learn history from a comprehensive stance. As such, the MDE remains committed to the teaching of history through diverse viewpoints while highlighting historical movements and moments that have shaped our nation. As educators, we have the responsibility to teach the full breadth of history to our children. This broad effort will help us to learn more about historical movements, events, and peoples that are part of the complex, diverse history of our country and world, and by extension, help us explore the same comprehensive history with our students. We are grateful for Dr. Chinea, our presenter today, and truly thank him for sharing his expertise and assisting in our growth of knowledge and understanding of this topic with our educators. I'd also like to thank the Teaching Comprehensive History webinar series team, including our ASL interpreter, Candace B., for its continued efforts in identifying and selecting key topics and for arranging and organizing this virtual space for us to gather and learn. Finally, I'd like to thank you, our attendees, for joining us on this teaching and learning journey. Thank you for your intentionality, interest, and courage in support of our students, which we refer to as our professional true north, and the preparation for their comprehensive understanding of our country and its history. And now I will turn it over to Mr. Scott Koenig, our MDE Social Studies consultant, serving in the Office of Educational Supports, to usher us forward into today's session.
Thank you, Dr. Edwards, and good afternoon, everyone. We're thrilled to have all of you in attendance as we continue the Comprehensive History webinar series. Before I turn over the presentation to today's presenter, I have some housekeeping announcements. Participants' video, audio, and chat features have been turned off. Questions for our presenter may be added using the Q&A feature. Questions will be addressed toward the end of this event as time permits. If time does not permit, questions will be addressed through email. We will provide links to resources using the chat feature throughout today's presentation. This presentation is being recorded and will be available on the Teaching Comprehensive History website. If you would like sketches for attending today, please be sure to sign in on the sketches link that will be provided on several occasions in the chat during this presentation. You can adjust your speaker view options anytime by selecting the View button at the top right of the Zoom window. At the conclusion of the webinar today, a survey will be emailed to participants. Please share your feedback as it helps inform future webinars. Closed captioning and an American Sign Language interpreter have been provided. If closed captioning isn't automatically visible, select the Show Subtitle option. Your interpreter for today is Candace B. The TCH webinars are intended to lift the knowledge of educators so that in turn you may provide opportunities for your students to inquire, think critically, and explore history from multiple perspectives you may have not heard before. As you listen today, you are invited to explore these opportunities to take new learning insights and ideas to your communities. Without further delay, please welcome Dr. Jorge Chinea. Dr. Chinea's specialization in colonial Latin American history makes him a sought-after content expert to learn from. He has researched and lectured across the globe and has been recognized by many distinguished organizations for his work. Most recently, Dr. Chinea was appointed to the rank of Distinguished Service Professor at Wayne State University. According to WSU policy, this classification is to be used in rare instances to designate senior members of the university faculty who have made extraordinary contributions to the university outside their own disciplines, or who, by unusual service outside of the university, have brought great honor and recognition to the institution. This prestigious title acknowledges Dr. Chinea's commitment to the CLLAS, the students, Wayne State University, and the WSU community. It's an honor to be working and learning from you today, Dr. Chinea. Welcome. Oh, Dr. Chinea, you might be muted.
Okay. Hey, thank you, Scott, so very much. I want to also thank Dr. Edwards, Candice, Jennifer, Renee, and of course, Dr. Rice for extending this invitation to be a part of this important initiative that is going, in my opinion, to significantly improve the teaching of comprehensive history in the state of Michigan. I want to, okay. I want to start the discussion by pointing out the role that the labor movement has played. And it's a central role because, as you know, the labor movement is really one of the first access points that we as humans have to enter and to take advantage of the rewards that our society offers. Oftentimes, those rewards have a strong economic incentive. So the history of one's position within the labor process tells us a lot about the success or lack of success that we will have down the road. And this is why when we educate people, we try to also give them the type of skill sets that they will need to enter the job market and be successful. Vice versa, by lacking those skills in the workplace, you also have a great disadvantage in entering the job market. And Latinos have faced many of those same hurdles that many other people have faced, but perhaps they have faced more hurdles along the way. So many of the laws that have been enacted in the United States, passed into law, or made into ordinances, or made into programs that offer better working opportunities for people, are the result of the labor movement's involvement in that process. And this is a poster that's available online for purchase, if I may add. Not that I'm encouraging people to buy it, but it was a poster that was available in a site that I used for this presentation. And it has that citation by Frederick Douglass at the end there. That's kind of an interesting way of summarizing the power that the labor movement has. Martin Luther King himself, although he was involved in the battle or the struggle for the inclusion of African Americans in our democratic institutions, he also thought and dealt with the importance of labor in helping people in their struggles to get a better, deal in the job place. And he spoke about this, and he also acted on that. And so, I guess what I'm saying here is labor is intimately connected to the social justice and civil rights movements that have been a part of the history of the United States, particularly in the post-1950s and 1960s. One of the persons who perhaps most people don't associate with labor was Marcus Garvey, the Jamaican-born leader, went around parts of Central America and the Caribbean talking to people of African descent, many of them persons who came into Central America or who lived in the non-Hispanic Caribbean and other places, to talk to them about how to improve yourself and how to make an impact, a greater impact in the world. He dreamed about this idea of encouraging workers to return to Africa and use their skills in revitalizing the old continent. And so for that reason, he founded the Universal Negro Improvement Association in the 1920s. When I had my first son in 1986, I named him Marcus Garvey because at the time I was very impressed and I admired its efforts to make the world a better place to live for everyone. The experience of Latinos, which is what we are addressing today, is also connected with the labor movement, but also more broadly with their status as subordinate or minoritized groups in the United States. Following the Mexican-American War that we touched on in the second video, the US annexed the national territory of our southern neighbor, half of that territory, I should say, including the states of California, Nevada, New Mexico, Arizona, and Texas. And as a result of that, essentially the border was redrawn. In essence, according to the people in those states, the border crossed them because it went on to the other side where they already lived. As a result of that change, many people who had properties, especially land in the old Southwest, gradually lost power and control over those resources. Eventually, they became displaced from the economy. And as a result of that, they joined a floating labor force of migrant workers who moved from town to town, from city to city, looking for better opportunities for themselves and for their families. At the same time, they faced other disabilities. Many of them did not have the official language that they once had. Spanish was taken away. English was imposed in these newly annexed territories. Many of them were relegated to subordinate groups and were more or less compelled to attend underfunded, educationally deficient, what they called then, quote unquote, Mexican-only schools. Racism and Jim Crowism, one of those things that we associate with the Old South, began to spread into Texas as a result of the annexation. The rights of Mexican Americans were compromised, and signs began to be seen posted in visible areas throughout the state of Texas and later in other states, warning people of Mexican descent that they were not welcome in certain places, be they parks, movie houses, restaurants, even schools. And of course, they were banned from participating in the political parties at the time. And so this created unbearable conditions for people living in those states, starting in Texas, but also in California, New Mexico, Arizona, and Colorado. So this state of affairs placed the Mexican-American population in a difficult situation. What were they to do? How could they respond to the massive transformation that they have been engaged in or involved in? Not of their making, but nevertheless, it was taking place. So Mexicans responded like many of us would do, right? We have a range of emotions when things happen to us. Many Mexicans who were Mexicans then, Mexican Americans later, felt the need to reconnect with their families, reconnect with their language, reconnect with their culture, and possibly connect back to the economy. So some of those Mexicans moved south across the new border that had been created into Mexico, leaving back in their own homelands some of their families and some of the property that had been taken away. Some Mexicans relied on tradition-bound institutions that have been in place in the former Spanish territories, and one of them was mutual aid societies or benevolent societies. And so they turned to these organizations to pull together resources and to band together in an effort to ameliorate or mitigate the negative impact of the changes that were taking place. Some others, out of desperation, engaged in social banditry. Joaquín Murrieta, Tiburcio Vázquez, Juan Cortina, and Gregorio Cortés. There are a number of ballads, a number of songs that the popular culture created and disseminated and memorialized about the actions of these individuals who were seen essentially as freedom fighters at the time within the Mexican population, but were also seen as criminals in the eyes of the new Anglo-American society that gradually took control of those communities. And we will talk a little bit about a couple of those social bandit images that were created as a result of that development. Others, like the Gorras Blancas, decided to take direct action to undermine some of the commercial interests that were gaining control of the properties that they once owned. In this case, they began to cut the wires of the fences that were encircling the former Spanish land grants that they had inherited, which were now in the hands of outsiders. And others, such as the League of United Latin American Citizens, formed LULAC in 1929. And notice that they didn't use the word League of Mexican Citizens or League of United Mexican Citizens. They used the word Latino or Latin American because at the time in the area, people associated Mexicans and Mexican culture with being a primitive, backward culture and a culture that was going to disappear in due time. And so because of that, people started creating new identities for themselves. And the League of United Latin American Citizens still exists and can be found on the internet, and people can participate. Here in the state of Michigan, there was a chapter of LULAC. And I understand that that chapter may be coming back to the state in the near future. This is how Hollywood tried to represent the changes that were taking place. In a typical, Hollywood style, they romanticize and in some ways created exotic images, constructed stereotypical notions of the people in the Southwest. And that came out in El Zorro TV series, a fox, that's what it means. And it was, even though it was a fictional character, it was also a way to essentially put down Mexican culture as a people that were more or less out of control. Because the real character behind El Zorro would have been Joaquín Murrieta, who have been opposing the changes that were taking place in the Southwest. El Zorro was one of the images. The other one was, that was a sanitized image. Then the more negative image is that was then pictured in dime, novels, in posters, in TV programs, and so on, that depicted Joaquín Murrieta and others like him as highway robbers, bandidos, right? Who were out there prowling on people for no reason and taking property from them, when in fact, what was really taking place was that these individuals were trying to regain what they had lost. So this is another sort of what I call socially constructed images that were being used and manipulated in the media to depict Mexicans in a negative light. This is a poster that was made about Las Gorras Blancas, or the white caps. And you'll notice from the two stakes that are holding the fence together, one of them is called injustice and the other one is called ignorance. So the writer, in this case, a resistance fighter, if you want to call it that way, was attempting to remove these two things, these two barriers to Mexican self-affirmation from the region. In a sense, they were fighting back against the system that kept them away from the properties that they once owned. It will take a significant amount of time for people to fight back in the court system to at least be heard about the injustices that they felt had occurred to them at that particular moment. But nevertheless, these situations eventually led to the formation of a labor rights mentality amongst Mexican Americans, and it built on notions that had already been in place and against some of the stereotypes that have been disseminated about them. Because from 1848 on, the typical images that many people had, right? These are people who don't have access to education, but even people who did have access to education, exhibited some of these ideas and repeated them publicly and in other places. They saw Mexicans as racially inferior, unambitious, lazy, hacienda-minded peons, docile, and unorganizable. Remember, unorganizable, because Cesar Chavez later on will prove that it was in fact possible, and they had to organize people, and there have been organizations already developed that began the process of restoring the labor rights of Mexican Americans. And for that, the Mexican Americans relied on some of the cultural attributes that they already had in place prior to 1848. They joined mutualist societies, cooperative societies, and even organizations that embrace anarchism and socialism. Some of these notions came to the Southwest from Mexico, because the Southwest was part of Mexico. And before Mexico, they came from many other parts, including the United States and Europe. And they had already been embraced in Mexico extensively. When we look back at the history of the Chicano labor movement, what you will find is that there were many organizations in place that our history books don't tend to recognize. We don't tend to include them in the narratives of the development of the labor movement, but they were there. I'm going to translate some of them really quickly. The first one stands for the Gray Workers' Circle. The second one is the National Workers' Confederation, 1876. Liga Obrera means Workers' League. Unión de Obreros means Workers' Union. Unión de Mineros, Union of Miners. The Confederación del Trabajo stands for the Labor Confederation. The Gran Liga Obrera de Ferrocarrileros means the Great Workers' League of Railroad Workers. The Gran Círculo de Obreros Libres means the Great Circle of Free Workers. All of these organizations were developed between 1876 and 1910. And they existed both in Mexico and in parts of the Southwest, where they were beginning to have embryonic organizations of this type. Between 1870 and 1910, 250 labor strikes took place in Mexico. By that time, half of all railroad workers in Mexico were unionized. So as the labor migration emerged after 1848, excuse me, after 1848, when the southwest portion of the United States underwent unprecedented economic development. For example, the railroads, commercial agriculture, and mining. Much of that labor that was needed was procured in Mexico and in Central America, and in some cases from the Caribbean. And the immigrants that came to the United States at that time, they carried the information about labor organizing with them. The fact that they could not act on those ideas is not that they didn't want to, but rather that there was a lot of opposition on the part of the management of many of these industries to keep labor organization from taking place. Cesar Chavez faced that dilemma, as everybody knows, when he tried to organize farm workers, because many of them were coming from Mexico and others were Mexican Americans, and the farmers made sure to divide and conquer the group by catering to one and not the other, or by otherwise obstructing the process of labor organizing. This legacy of working to change the labor condition of Mexican Americans spread outside of the Southwest through the fanning out effect that took place between 1848 and 1930s. As I mentioned before, many people in the US Southwest felt that they were essentially oppressed, that they couldn't get the right job, they couldn't get paid the right wages, they couldn't get promoted, they couldn't get into a good school, they couldn't live in a safe community without fear for their lives or fear of being picked on, singled out, or mistreated in some type of way. So people began to migrate out of the Southwest in the same way that African Americans experienced what we now call the Great Migration from the South. And so Latinos also had that same experience. And as they began to spread out, they carried some of these organizations with them, and they joined others that were non-Latino. For example, the Alianza Hispanoamericana, or the Western Federation of Labor, the United Mine Workers, the United Workers of the World, the IWW, the AFL-affiliated federal labor unions, or the Renters Union of America, and the Land League of America. Eventually, Alianza morphed into the Liga Protectora Latina, which stands for the Latino Protective League. And they adopted the motto, one for all, all for one. And I want you to remember that one, because the first civil rights organization developed in the United States, LULAC, adopted the same logo. It's the same motto, sorry. So where did they go? Well, Mexican Americans spread out to wherever there were jobs to be had, whatever opportunities became available. They didn't necessarily pick and choose, they just simply went to where the job market possibilities will take them. And so in Michigan, the Latino population began to arrive right around 1900. Many of them were contracted by enganchista, or labor recruiters. The word enganchista means the guy who hooked you. Essentially, they offer you dream wages, wonderful living conditions, a great place where everybody welcome you with open hands, and you will be able to make a lot of money and raise your family. Of course, that was not the case. And some of them were traqueros or track workers, section hands, and they follow the trains. By the way, that experience of following the railroads to fend out of the old Southwest began in Mexico during the Porfirio Diaz dictatorship, when he began to attract foreign capital and foreign technology to Mexico. In 1876, he allowed the railroad companies to point northwards towards the United States, so that as oil, gold, silver, copper, and agricultural products were being harvested, they could be then funneled through those trains towards the United States for sale in the north. So consequently, many Mexicans already knew that this is the way to go. You take the train, move from Mexico to the Southwest, from the Southwest to other places in the United States. Others worked here in the state of Michigan in the steel plants and in the automobile industry. What those jobs offer Mexicans was something that they never had. And that is, when Mexicans work in the field, they were exposed to the elements. They were exposed to insects, right? You're exposed to snakes. You might sleep in a chicken coop, or you might sleep inside of a car. When you work in a steel plant in the automobile industry, you work in indoors. And once that step happened, Mexicans began to set roots in the state. And they began to live all across the state, from Adrian, Saginaw, Pontiac, Flint, Port Huron, Battle Creek, Grand Rapids, and other cities. By about 1930, about 10,000 persons of self-identified Mexican descent were living in the state of Michigan. In the commercial farming sector, many of them used the experience that they had in Mexico working in sugar beets to also work in that industry in the United States. And the common term that we used for them was betabeleros, or sugar beet workers. When we think about the importance of all of these industries, we can see in the background how Michigan evolved over time, right? How the different industries were set up, expanded, and made Michigan the state that it is today. Mexicans played a pivotal hand in making that possible. There was two reasons for that I'd like to point out really quickly. With respect to sugar, keep in mind that the per capita sugar consumption in the United States rose significantly during the Industrial Revolution. People needed coffee with sugar. People needed candy. People needed beverages to keep them awake. Sugar keeps people awake. It makes you want to work hard. And so as sugar consumption per capita increased, so did the need to find alternate means of producing sugar. Most of the sugar that was consumed in the United States, with the exception of Louisiana and parts of Florida, came from Cuba and Puerto Rico. In fact, starting in 1845, 75% of Puerto Rican sugar went into the United States. Most of Cuban sugar from that time and throughout the 19th century entered the United States from Cuba. When Cuba abolished slavery in the latter part of the 19th century, and so did Puerto Rico, the sugar economy had to readjust. And therefore, there was a need for alternate sources of sugar. And so the sugar beet economy, which began to spread in the 1840s, when the slave trade was just about ready to be abolished, when that began to spread in the United States, it became an alternate means of procuring sugar. That and maple sugar were the two alternatives to sugarcane. And that's why this industry was pivotal in the development of Michigan, but also in the development of other areas in the United States, Colorado, California, and so on and so forth. So how did the Puerto Ricans come here, right? I'm from Puerto Rico, was raised in Puerto Rico until the age of 13, and then I came to the United States in 1967. When I was in Puerto Rico, I often heard from people saying, I'm going to Wisconsin, I'm going to Chicago, I'm going to, different states, Indiana, Ohio. I never understood what they were doing. But now that I lived in the state of Michigan, I understand what happened. Many Puerto Ricans began to be recruited to work in the United States, first in Hawaii. Why Hawaii? Because Hawaii had a sugar industry. Many Puerto Ricans have been working in the sugar industry primarily in the second half of the 19th century, but also on coffee. Coffee was the second most important industry, but unfortunately, the US does not grow coffee. So the only jobs that Puerto Ricans could get outside of agriculture were minimal. And so many of them work in commercial agriculture producing sugar in Hawaii. Many of them did not like sugar work in Hawaii for a lot of different reasons: mistreatment, low wages, ethnic conflicts, and so on. Many of them decided to go back to the mainland and relocated in California. And this is the same story that you find in many other states. So many of the Puerto Ricans that came to Michigan were on their way to Hawaii, which the boat that carried them from Puerto Rico made a stop in New Orleans. And in New Orleans, they would then take a train to get them to California, and from there to Hawaii. They got off the boat in New Orleans and decided to take a chance in other locations. Eventually, they found their way to Detroit, and they represented the very first elements of Puerto Rican culture to come to Michigan. Thereafter, in the 20s and 30s and 40s, they began to relocate from Michigan from nearby states like Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. In the late 1940s, the sugar big growers came up with an idea to replace or supplement the Mexican labor force by having workers from other areas flown to Michigan. So Operation Farm Lift developed out of that proposal that was embraced by the Puerto Rican government and approved by the US government. And eventually 5,000 Puerto Ricans were flown from Puerto Rico to Saginaw. And from there, we had the same thing that we saw in Hawaii. People were dissatisfied. They reported that they were not sleeping in good places, that they were not getting the right wages, that they were being mistreated, that they were treated as aliens. Remember that Puerto Ricans in the 1940s were US citizens. Puerto Ricans became citizens in 1917. Since 1917, every Puerto Rican entering the US is a US citizen, something that continues to baffle a lot of people. In fact, I was watching the internet the other day, two cases that happened when two Puerto Rican flyers were asked to produce their passport at different airports to prove that they were citizens of the US. And they kept telling the airline companies, we're United States citizens, the law only allows us to produce a driver's license from Puerto Rico, which is as good in Puerto Rico as it is in the US. You need to accept that driver's license, and they wouldn't until the companies later learned, oh my God, they are US citizens. We made some mistakes. But this is just today. I've been reading this 3-4 days ago. Eventually, many of the people who came from Puerto Rico in the 1940s was really, in some way, in the same situation as Mexican Americans, in the sense that the US began a major industrialization program in the 1940s called Operation Bootstrap. The idea was to find a way to provide year-round employment to Puerto Ricans outside of agriculture. The program was supposed to work by inviting foreign corporations and American corporations to relocate to Puerto Rico and offer those jobs. They did initially when they were given tax exemptions. When those tax exemptions went away, so did the companies. Eventually, many Puerto Ricans found themselves in congested urban communities and no jobs. Then the US and the government of Puerto Rico came up with another idea, a neo-Malthusian approach. The idea was to try to do what Robert Malthus in England has suggested, which is to get people to leave England for other places. So the same thing happened in Puerto Rico, and people were encouraged through a very, complicated media campaign to come to the United States, where jobs were plentiful, housing was great, people would be welcome, and they were even encouraged to reduce the number of children in order to fit in with the American life. And so a family program was simultaneously instituted to reduce the numbers of children per family so that Puerto Ricans would be less, they would make an easier transition to North American life. So this is the context through which many Puerto Ricans came to the United States. Some of them ended up in Michigan, of course, but some of them, they continued to migrate to Illinois, New York, and later Pennsylvania, Connecticut, New Jersey, and so on and so forth. Today, there are about 5 million Puerto Ricans in the United States. In fact, there are more Puerto Ricans in the United States mainland than there are Puerto Ricans in Puerto Rico at the moment. So what was the reception of these, Latino newcomers that are now becoming part of the social and labor fabric of countless communities across the mainland, and who oftentimes speak English with an accent or only are monolingual Spanish speakers, who are also essentially Roman Catholics and who come from a long tradition of racial miscegenation? How are they to fit into a bipolar or binary United States culture that emphasizes the presence of African Americans and whites? How do you integrate Latinos into that picture? Well, according to the historians who had looked at this question, the problem is that to many people at that time, I'm talking about that, 1900, 1910s, 1920s, the Latinos were good workers, but not good material to become citizens. There was a lot of sort of social Darwinist infused stereotypes at the time that tried to belittle and downgrade and put down Latino culture as being somewhat of an anomaly, like something that shouldn't be. The fact that people were comfortable being Indian, Black, Asian, and of European ancestry, having a blend of all of those, did not fit in well in the mindset of many people at that time. There was also a movement in the 1920s called the eugenics movement. And that movement was an attempt to manipulate the genetic composition of people with the idea of essentially getting rid of undesirable racial traits. The eugenics movement was actually connected to the family planning movement that was taking place simultaneously. In Puerto Rico, family planning began in the 1920s. And by the 1965, by one account, 35% of Puerto Rican women were permanently infertile. they couldn't have children because they had gone through what they call la operación, or the operation that essentially tied their tubes so that they couldn't have children for good. Those perceptions, that climate of opinion was in the air when people were thinking about how to integrate or not integrate the Latino population that was showing up in many places in the United States. Unfortunately, the local media never got wind of this situation as much because Latinos, according to this article by Reisler, were hidden from sight, generally speaking, particularly in the Southwest. But even in places in Michigan, they're not the kind of people that you were likely to run into on a daily basis, right? Even today, it will take you have to drive to a farming community to locate Mexican workers working in the fields. They don't show up in the urban areas as much. They tend to be housed or living near or close to farming communities. But that was not then. Then, people were totally isolated. But anyway, this notion of mongrelization, of the possibility that we were going to go back in time to a feudal past, worry a lot of people and send, put into place these attitudes that were not fostering the integration of Latinos into the wider society. But this is one of the results of all of those changes, right? The creation of LULAC in 1929 was an effort to connect the dots. Remember the Liga Protectora Latina, the protective Latino League, that they had the logo, the motto, all for one and one for all. Now we begin that becoming the motto of the first civil rights organization. These are indications that labor and social activism went hand in hand as far as people of Latino heritage were concerned, that you could work in the United States, but what happens outside the workplace may still affect you. So that there was a need not only to reform the job place, but to reform the wider society and make it more receptive to people of Latino descent. And this is why LULAC was created in 1949. Another organization that came out of that era, but only 20 years later, is the American GI Forum. A lot of this organization was comprised totally of people who came from World War II and entered the civilian population and found themselves with fewer rights as civilians than they had when they were soldiers. And so what they did was they got together and decided that we need to do something about it. But they also embraced a civil rights agenda with a touch of education. Look at the motto. Education is our freedom, and freedom should be everybody's business. And so you begin to see a connection from labor to civil rights to education. Later on, you will see this expand into other social justice causes, especially, educational reform, health reform, housing reform, and so on and so forth. My uncle was part of that generation. My father was part of that generation. My father came to the mainland of the United States in 1940 on a steamship from Puerto Rico, not a plane. There were no planes in 1940, except in the military. So he came on a steamship. He lived in Mississippi and Tennessee for a while. Eventually, he settled in Florida. And from there, he spent some time in Washington, D.C., had 2 children in Washington, D.C., and then later moved to New York, where he died. His brother, Raúl, his brother, Rafael, and his brother, Jose, all of them served with him in the 65th Infantry Division of the U.S. Army. Rafael, by now known as Ralph in English, was one of the people that was condecorated in the war. with a Bronze Star. And his infantry division was not recognized up until recently. So essentially, they won the recognition back in the 50s, but it was only 40, 50 years later that people say, well, let's look at the record, and eventually the 65th Infantry Division, which is called the Borincaneers. The word Borinquen means Puerto Rico in the indigenous language of Puerto Rico, which was Arawak, before Columbus arrived in 1492. So the Borincaneers distinguished themselves in the military, and for that reason, they received this congressional medal. So they were more than just my uncle and the generation of the 40s. Starting in World War I, 200,000 Latinos serving the U.S. Armed Forces. During World War II, that doubled up to 500,000 men and women. And there were at least 53,000 Puerto Ricans who served in those wars, particularly in World War II. At the same time that these former soldiers, now civilians, are entering the job market, there's also a need for more labor in the United States to redevelop not only the wartime industry or to maintain it during the wars, but also to develop the post-World War II economy. So the US government established something called the Bracero program. Bracero means literally manual worker. Bracero means brazo, which means arm. These are people who are brought to the United States to do manual work in many wartime industries, but they stay beyond that because the contract was started in 1942 and did not end until 1964. The United States welcomed 125,000 Mexicans to work in the US. However, we did not thank them. And this is one of those sad moments that makes us kind of like, what's going on here? In 1954, the US Department of Labor thought that there were too many Mexicans in the United States, and they implemented Operation Wetback. And by that means, they expelled 1.3 million Mexicans from the United States. This is another reason why Operation Farm Lift that I mentioned earlier was created, because many companies in the US felt that if the US keeps pushing Mexicans out, we will not have enough workers to do the work in the farms and in other areas. And so that's why they turned to Puerto Rico to get workers from the island. Okay, there was another movement in between 1917 and 1940 something at the end of World War II. And this was called the repatriation movement. This happened during the Great Depression. Essentially, during that time, the worst of us came out, right? People who felt that the US economy had collapsed started seeing danger everywhere. And xenophobia and nativism began to creep up. And we began to look as foreigners, not as the people who helped us develop the economy, but as potential enemies in our midst, people who need to go back, people who we should not offer jobs to, and people who are not deserving of unemployment benefits or charity services available to people during times like this. As a result of that, we deported between 300,000 and 1 million Mexicans at that time. Many of them were workers. Some of them were Mexican citizens, and some of them, most of them were Mexican citizens, but there were also amongst them Mexican Americans or US citizens who were sent back because people could not distinguish between Mexican Americans and non-Mexican Americans. Okay, so I'm at the end here, so let me work quickly here. So this is a book that perhaps you would like to see as a teacher. It chronicled the repatriation movement. It has a beautiful painting. It's a sad image, but it's a beautiful painting developed by a local artist, Nora Mendoza, Nora Chapa Mendoza. And we held programs about that book here in Michigan. Another major organization was created in the late 1960s to protect the rights of Mexican Americans in many areas, not just labor, but in education, in politics, in housing, in health. The Puerto Rican Legal Defense Funds were created likewise to follow on the same agenda as MALDEF. And the Chicano movement came out of that struggle. We already mentioned Cesar Chavez before, but I think it's worth remembering that Cesar Chavez was thinking about labor rights from a broader angle. And he included in that angle all of the areas in which workers are affected, right? They get affected in their religious needs, their spiritual needs, they get affected in their communities, they get affected in their industries that they're trying to organize, they get affected in the environment. There are consumer rights issues that workers deal with. There's also a need to encourage people to vote, to become eligible for vote, and to vote, to become eligible for U.S. citizenship. And also he fought racial and economic discrimination as a labor leader. So that's important to keep in mind. This is a portrait that was made that captures the universality of the thinking of Cesar Chavez as a person who was paying attention to the wider world around him, and not just as workers, but as the people, as a group. The Young Lords and the Brown Berets was another more militant organization that came out of that same era. But many of them, believe it or not, many of them were interested in labor. For example, the Young Lords fought for health care, housing, and they fought against police brutality, and they fought what they call the garbage offensive, trying to fight against the sanitation department in New York City not doing its job in communities of color. But when the organization ended in the early 1970s, they mutated into the Puerto Rican Revolutionary Workers Organization. That shows that even the Young Lords, who started with a pretty much social justice agenda, will come back to look at the issues of labor and labor rights again as they step away from the more militant agenda into a different one. Thank you very much. I enjoyed the presentation, and I look forward to your comments and questions from now on.
Thank you, Dr. Chinea, for sharing your knowledge with us throughout this three-part series. This content has been incredible. I've learned so much, and I am confident our attendees have learned as well. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Your work is important to Michigan's educators and leaders as we work to teach comprehensive history within our classrooms. We sincerely appreciate you creating this series in support of this important Michigan Department of Education effort. So thank you.
You're welcome.
The next webinar series will be a 90-minute webinar titled Social Studies Classroom Practice and Pedagogy. It continues on June 7th from 4 to 5:30 p.m. Please note that each webinar will present new content. We encourage educators to visit the Teaching Comprehensive History website and register for each date to participate in the future webinar. The last one, by the way, so don't miss it. As we are linking and has been linked in the chat box already, we invite you to register if you haven't again. Thank you all for joining us today. We will stick around for a few more minutes for you attendees to grab any links that you may need from the chat. If you have any issues, please email us. We will put that email in there at teachingcomprehensivehistory@michigan.gov for us to assist you, our team. Again, we appreciate everyone. Dr. Chinea, once again, Thank you
bless.
so much. We appreciate your time, your efforts, and we congratulate you on your recent prestigiousness, if I can. So
Thank you. I
thank
appreciate
you
that.
all. Have a great evening.